So we're excited today to host virtually Master Gardener Gretel Anspach to discuss seed saving. We will record this program, as you may know, and I'll send it out to the registrants tomorrow. We'll make it available on our website for the season as well. And Gretel was nice enough to share her slides as well. We're going to be sure to send those out to everybody as well. Um, I want to quickly highlight that the Topsfield Town Library has relaunched our seed library. It's another way that the library continues to push the definition of what a library is, while remembering and acknowledging Topsfield's roots as an agricultural town. The seed library is free to use for the entire community. Please feel free to come in or visit our website for more information. During this presentation, we will talk about the reasons for saving your own seeds and learn some of the basic techniques for ensuring genetic purity. We will include discussions about the home garden plants from which seeds can be easily saved and stored for future use. And the person that we have today that will be helping us through this process is Gretel Anspach, who is a trustee of the Massachusetts Agricultural Society, lifetime Master Gardener with the Massachusetts Master Gardener Association, and a recently retired systems engineer for Raytheon. She won the MMGA Lifetime Achievement Award in 2016. Gretel established and maintains a 20,000 square foot food production garden that has provided fresh produce for the Marlborough and Maynard food pantries for the last 10 years. Her primary interest and focus is always in the science behind horticulture. So without further ado, I am going to cede the floor to our expert for the evening, Gretel, and I hope everyone enjoys. So Gretel, take it away.
Sean, thank you very much. Thank you for the seed pun, ceding the floor to me. One correction is that I'm from a trustee of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, not agricultural. As we go along, if you have any questions, I would ask that you type them into chat, and I will take a look at them at the end. Make sure that the chat either goes to me or to everybody, not just to Sean, or we're going to make him read all the questions, which we don't need to do. So, seed saving. We're going to go through some terminology, then we're going to talk about what to save, how to harvest it, and how to preserve it. When you look at a flower, this is an apple blossom, for example, so we dub it a perfect flower, which means that it has both male parts and female parts. You can tell by looking at it that it is pollinated by some critter, probably insects, but it could be something else, because it puts on a show, because it has big showy petals. If you look at things that are wind pollinated, like ragweed, they don't have a big show because they don't need to attract anything. Going in from the outside, the next circle of stuff is dubbed by us to be the male parts. Altogether, each is called a stamen, and it consists of a filament, which is a thin thread to hold the anther up out of the middle of the plant to where the pollinators can get at it. Anthers make and contain pollen. Pollen is the male gamete, which is to say it has half the genetic material of the plant, and we dub it male because that's how we think. In the middle is the female bit. Altogether, it's called a pistil. The bit at the bottom that will, if they get fertilized, have seeds in it is called the ovary. Those seeds, until they get fertilized, are called ovules. Then there is a long tube called the style, connecting it up to the stigma, which is a sticky pad that can receive pollen. In order for this plant to be pollinated, it looks really simple because all that has to happen is for a grain of pollen to get onto the stigma and germinate. But it can be more complicated than that because some plants have a block against this flower pollinating this flower. The idea is to outcross, to cross to something else to promote genetic diversity. So getting the right pollen onto the stigma can be difficult. There's also no mechanism for the flower to clean pollen off the stigma. So if that stigma gets covered up with pollen from I don't care, rhododendron, the plant isn't going to make any seeds. Often what triggers making the fruit is the seeds getting fertilized, at least one seed getting fertilized. And each seed is the product of one ovule and one pollen grain. When you think about how many seeds there are in an ear of corn, which is wind pollinated, or how many seeds there are in a big old watermelon, every one of those required a separate pollen grain to fertilize that ovule. The fruit has two parts to it. If you're looking at an apple, there's the core, which is actually the ovary. It develops into a juicy case that surrounds the seeds. And then there's the hypanthium, which doesn't develop in an awful lot of plants. In the flower, it's just a bit of tissue that ties everything together. But we've bred apples, or selected apples, I should say, with giant hypanthia, which is most of what we eat. Because the apple hypanthium, most of what we eat, and the core is strictly from around the ovary, which I'm going to call the mom, it just tastes of mom. So if a Granny Smith apple got pollinated by a Macoun apple, the apple tastes like Granny Smith. It's all mom. The seeds are the only part that is a genetic combination of the two. As a result, you can't tell by eating the fruit whether this plant inbred or outbred, which is interesting when you're saving seeds. Some plants have been inbred to the point where they breed true, and we call these open pollinated cultivars. So these are 4 o'clocks. There is an open pollinated cultivar that is red. And if you breed 2 of these red plants together, you're going to get a red plant, a plant with red flowers. The white one is also open pollinated. It's been inbred such that all of the flowers are white. And if you breed 2 white ones, you're going to get a white one. If you cross a white one and a red one, because the genetics are really simple in this case, you're going to get a pink flowering plant. But you've also broken the inbreeding. And that means that if you cross this pink one with anything else, including a pink one, you're not going to get just one color. You're going to get a whole bunch of different colors. If it's flower color, it's sort of no big deal, because if you really just wanted pink flowers, you can cull the others out as soon as you see what color, as soon as the bud forms. The problem is if it's taste, because you aren't going to know that until the fruit matures. For people who get confused by this, I then start talking about dogs. So the species is every dog there is, with all the variation in size and shape and everything else. A Cocker Spaniel could be considered an open pollinated cultivar of dogs, because if you breed 2 Cocker Spaniels, you get a Cocker Spaniel. A poodle could be considered another open pollinated cultivar of dogs, because if you breed 2 poodles, you get a poodle. If you cross a poodle and a Cocker Spaniel, the result is extremely predictable because both of those cultivars are so inbred. and what you get is a cockapoo. People do that because they know exactly what they're going to get. But if you breed a cockapoo with anything else, what you're going to get is a mutt. And that's what happens when you breed F1 hybrids with something else. So if you want to save seeds, you need an open pollinated hybrid. When you're looking for one in a seed catalog, it will either say OP or it won't say anything, or it'll say heirloom. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. If it says hybrid or F1 or F2 or anything like that, it is not going to breed true. We often go with hybrids, we grow them because by happy accident, we really liked the way this cross turned out and we can continue making it. Often they have this thing called hybrid vigor. In the picture at the bottom, the parents are on either side and the hybrid child is in the middle. Heirloom is another tag you'll see on a seed or on a plant. It doesn't have a very specific meaning. It just kind of means it's old. We do know it's open pollinated. It's been inbred to that point. There's an implication that it has more old-fashioned goodness, probably less commercial viability, but not necessarily. What we also know about it is that they may not be unique plants, because if the wagon train was heading west and some people got off in Pennsylvania and then another group got off in Missouri, all pulling out of the same sack of beans, they didn't necessarily name those beans the same thing. And they may have, even if they did name them the same thing, they may have changed over the last 100 years, over the last 50 years. Sometimes heirlooms have a lower germination rate. Sometimes they're harder to start. Sometimes they have lower yield. They probably have more flavor than average, but to me, the best tasting tomato is Sun Gold. It's a orange cherry tomato, and it's an F1 hybrid, so there are no guarantees there. The thing that we really do know about it is that it is superbly adapted to grow wherever it's been growing for the last 50 to 100 years. And that also means that it's great for the soil there and it works great or is resistant against the diseases that are prevalent there. That doesn't mean that it's going to be as effective here. One year I did a search on what is the best tasting tomato, and the results came back Brandywine, which is Pennsylvania, Delaware-ish. I tried growing Brandywine seeds. For me, they tasted like nothing. And it's not that those folks were lying, it's that there is such a thing as terroir, which is what all of the wine people talk about, the taste that the land gives the grape, the taste the land gives the fruit. And my terroir is just wrong for Brandywine. So by all means, try heirlooms, but if they don't work for you, it's probably not your fault. It's just probably not a great match. Buy seeds. We buy seeds because we can grow new things every year. We don't have to think about genetic purity. We don't have to think about storing seeds. And in some cases, it gives us the option of buying seedlings instead of starting the seeds indoors and having those seedlings take over our houses. You save seeds because the heirlooms can be interesting. You know they worked here. If the plant grew well enough here this year that you're thinking of saving seeds, then it's a good match. After a while, some varieties may not be available. So if you save seeds, you can be ensured you're always going to have it. And it's free. To think when you start thinking about saving seeds, the first set of considerations are getting viable seeds, getting seeds that actually will germinate. And for that, You need a plant that can produce fertile seeds. You need those seeds to be pollinated, to be created, and then you need the fruit to ripen before you can harvest the seeds. If beyond that you want them to breed true, the plants need to be open pollinated. They need to breed within the cultivar, sufficient separation, and you need a large enough population and to keep the genetics going. And I'll talk about all of those. Most garden plants can make seeds, but not all of them. Ferns and mosses and all of those reproduce by spores, completely different biology. It's stunning how different it is. Seedless cultivars kind of don't make seeds. You'll get one or two seeds, maybe out of a seedless watermelon, but I'm guessing they're not going to breed true. So, and then there are all of the others, grapes and oranges and bananas. The other thing is that if the species is single, if it looks like your standard daisy, if you find a cultivar that is doubled, that has lots and lots more petals, there's a decent chance it's going to be sterile because the doubling happens when the sexual bits are replaced by more petals. The advantage to the growers is that it lasts longer because a lot of the time the plant tries to keep a flower going until the seeds are fertilized and there are no seeds. So it blooms longer, but you're not going to save seeds. The other thing is that there are some plants that make lots and lots of seeds, but they're mostly sterile. So a lot of the plants, in fact, that the ecologists argue with the growers about on whether this plant is invasive, make mostly sterile seeds. Burning bush, if it makes 1,000 seeds, maybe 10 of them are fertile. I made those numbers up. But the point is, if you're trying to have the plant not spread, 10 is too many. But if you're trying to start the plant from seed, 10 is really not enough. You don't want to have to start that many seeds in order to get a few that actually grow. Then you need the plant to get pollinated. Some plants are self-pollinating. If there was only one dandelion left in the world and it only had one flower and there were no bees, it can still make viable dandelion seeds. All of the plants listed there can do that. So great, you're going to get fertile seeds. Some plants can do that, but they can't do it well. So tomatoes are going to get much better pollination if there's a bumblebee around that can do this buzz pollination thing. That means you're going to have more seeds. It also means you're probably going to have a bigger fruit because a lot of plants, the size of the fruit has to do with how many of the seeds get pollinated. If you have grown squash or cucumbers before, there's some that are fat on one end and thin on the other. The thin end didn't get pollinated. Some plants have male and female flowers on the same plant, and they can be self-pollinating, provided you get both plants, both flowers. So every few years, we get a question on squash where people call in and say, my squash is covered with flowers. I have lots of bees, but I don't have any fruit. What's going on? Well, it turns out, again, I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong, but the concept is right, that squash makes separate male and female flowers, that if the nighttime temperature is above 85 for 5 days in a row, when the plant is in a specific development stage, it doesn't make female flowers, and only the female flowers can make fruit. You can tell the difference between the male flowers and the female flowers. And for this, you should look at me, not the slide. The male flowers look like that. They have a stem and then they have a flower. The female flowers look like that. They have a stem, and then they have this thing that looks like a tiny little fruit right behind the flower. That's the ovary. And then they have the flower. So if you don't see any female flowers, you're not going to get any fruit. What some farmers do about this is they plant squash and then they plant more squash 2 weeks later on the assumption that you're not likely to get that really unfortunate weather exactly 2 weeks apart. So one or the other is going to make fruit. Some plants have perfect flowers, and perfect means they have both male and female bits in the same flower, but you need two separate varieties for best pollination. And you'll see this on some fruit trees and on blueberries and on the red-berried holly, where they say you got to get a male. Nope, that's a different one. Forget the holly, where they say best pollination if you get two different varieties. Those two varieties need to bloom at the same time, but what you're doing is there's a chemical block between this flower against this flower pollinating itself. And that block extends to a different flower on this plant pollinating this flower. With trees and shrubs, since breeding them is so slow, a lot of the time the named varieties are clones. You take a cutting, you make a new plant, but it's genetically identical to the old plant. And that means that if there's a block against a flower on this plant pollinating this plant, there's going to be a block against that clone over there that has the same name pollinating this plant. So you need two separate varieties if you want to get decent pollination. And then some plants have male and female flowers on separate plants. That's where the holly comes in. You need both, but only the females can make the berries, can make the fruit. Hollies is a big one there. If you're growing sunflowers for seeds, then you can use the pollenless sunflowers because they only have female flowers in them. But if you're growing them for the pollinators, you should get both kinds. You should get an old-fashioned sunflower that has male and female parts in it. The reason they make pollenless sunflowers is for the cut flower trade, so the flower doesn't leak yellow pollen all over your white tablecloth. And then to make it more complicated, there are some plants that can make a fruit even if they didn't get pollinated. Some cucumbers, for example, they're called parthenocarpic, and it means that they will go ahead and make a fruit even without being pollinated, but you're not going to get viable seeds out of that. Then you need the fruit to actually ripen. You need the seeds to ripen. Ripe for botany is not the same thing as ripe for cooking. Ripe for cooking means it tastes good. Ripe for botany means the seed has matured. So green bell peppers are not ripe. The seeds are not mature. It needs to turn red for the seeds to be mature. Summer squash, the way we eat them, this is not ripe. When it ripens, it looks a lot more like a winter squash. It's got a thick hide. It's gnarly. It has a completely different texture, but it has ripe seeds in it. The only time we eat peas ripe is in something like split pea soup. We usually harvest them a lot earlier while they're still sweet. With tomatoes, it's getting harder to tell because they now have tomatoes like green zebra that ripen green, but they're softer when they're ripe. So again, the last harvest of fruit off the vine to beat the frost, and then you're going to make fried green tomatoes. You can't get viable seeds out of that. Sunflowers, when the seed is ripe, It's got a hard shell to it. Butternut squash, we do eat ripe. When it's green, the seeds are not ripe. When it's brown, they are. And I threw the cleome in the middle as well. Cleome is an interesting plant because it just keeps blooming and blooming, and the stem gets longer and the flowers are near the top, and then it makes these pods. And there's a tendency to want to grab those pods to grab the seeds, but the pod's got to be pretty far along in order for the seeds to be ripe. It doesn't have to be quite as dry as in the picture of it on the right, but if you break open the pod and the seeds are still green, they're not ripe. A lot of the time, for the seeds that are in less juicy plants, brown is a symbol that they've gone ripe. So to get seeds that breed true, you need open pollinated plants, not hybrids, not clones. You need them to breed within that cultivar, and we'll talk about separation next. And you need a large enough population to prevent inbreeding depression. For some reason, corn gets depressed very easily, and you need 200 plants of the same cultivar, or within a couple of generations, you have puny little plants and almost no production. But most plants can survive a few generations of serious inbreeding without a negative effect. So I keep talking about safe separation. So separation from what? We have this taxonomy of plants that characterizes each plant as being in a division and a class and an order, all the way down to its species name, which includes a genus and a specific epithet. It is worth knowing some of this because not just of seed saving, but also because of crop rotation. So I'm going to do a quick diversion into that. When they say rotate crops, what they mean is rotate by family. So that does not mean planting your squash where your melons were last year because they're in the same family. It means planting maybe your squash where your tomatoes were and planting your tomatoes where your onions were, because those are all different families. If you have a tiny little garden and you have no disease issues, you don't need to rotate crops. But if it starts getting large enough that you have fertility issues or you have insect issues, crop rotation can help. And if you have specific non-endemic diseases like clubroot, then absolutely you need to do crop rotation to kill off that disease on your property. So back to seed saving. We are in this case looking at the genus Cucurbita that has squash in it. And there are 4 species of Cucurbita that we mostly eat: Maxima, Mixta, Moschata, and Pepo. The one that we eat most is Cucurbita pepo. If 2 plants are in the same species and they bloom at the same time, they absolutely can interbreed. 2 plants are in, yeah. All of these plants are the same species. So if you are growing yellow crookneck squash and acorn squash in the same garden, they are both Cucurbita pepo, and they will interbreed because the bees don't care. They're just going to go wherever they go. These can interbreed. The result is going to be a genetic cross of the 2, and it may not taste like either of them. Maybe better, maybe worse. A friend of mine saved seeds from a delicata squash one year. That's the picture on the bottom right. The next year she grew them. They looked like delicata squash. They did not taste like anything. They were not worth growing. That's the problem with this species in particular, that there is so much diversity of taste that crosses can mess up. To make it even more complicated, These four pumpkins are all in different species. So if there was nothing else around and you grew these four pumpkins, you could grow them right on top of each other and they would breed true. They can't intercross. What is sufficient separation? How far apart do I need to put my yellow crookneck squash and my acorn squash to get them to breed true? About 800 feet to half a mile. If your property is a quarter acre, you're not going to accomplish this because you don't know what your neighbor is growing. There are other things like eggplant that the insects can come from far, far away. But interestingly, despite the fact that eggplant and tomato are very closely related, with tomatoes, it's more like 50 feet. You'll know it bred true if there's no other tomato within 50 feet of this one. There are others like lettuce and peas where it's 10 or 20 feet. Half a mile is about the biggest, and that includes the wind pollinated ones and a whole bunch of the cucurbitas. Does this matter? Well, maybe, because a lot of the time by now people are looking pretty depressed. If you are marketing the seeds as being a specific cultivar, it matters because if your Brandywine cross with your Sun Gold, they're not Brandywine anymore. If there's a significant variation in taste, like between acorn squash and yellow crookneck, or appearance within the species, then it probably matters. All of these brassicas, all of these cabbagey things are the same species, so they can all interbreed. If you're marketing the seeds more generally, like it's a tomato, then none of this matters. And if there isn't a whole lot of difference in taste inside that species, like in my opinion, with lettuce and with cucumbers and with beans, then it doesn't matter. Go ahead, let them outcross. It's still going to be good food. So that's the how do you get seed that you want to save. Now let's talk about actually saving the seed. There are many plants that we grow that are grown as annuals, like tomatoes. Pretty much anything where we eat the fruit and we replant it every year, we grow them as annuals. Some truly are annuals. A lot of them are tropical, and they just will come to fruit fast enough that we can grow them as annuals. But if they were grown in a greenhouse or in Florida, they would just keep growing. Some of what we grow are biannuals, and biannuals also have one flowery, fruity sequence before they die, only one, but it takes them at least 2 years to do that. So the first year, they usually make a rosette of leaves. They also usually make a big old taproot, which stores enough energy for them to come back next year with a head start. Then the next year, they come back, they generate a flowering stalk, get that pollinated, make seeds, and then the plant dies. If you want to save seeds off of beets or Swiss chard or turnips or cabbage or carrots or onions, you need to have them in the ground 2 years. You need to get them through that first winter, and some of them aren't that hardy up here, so you may need to dig them up and replant them. If you just want to save onion seeds for the heck of it, the other thing you can do is plant a store-bought onion, because once it makes that big bulb, you know it's already ready for its second year. So if you plant a onion that started making a shoot, it's not going to make another onion bulb, but it is going to make seeds, and you can harvest those seeds if you want. So with biannuals, you need to get them into the second year, let them bolt, which means make that flower stalk, let them flower, set seed, and then collect it. We divide seed into two categories, which are dry seed heads and fleshy seed heads. Dry seed heads are like grain and like the cleome I showed you, and peas and things like that, where there isn't a whole lot of meat around around the seeds. You let them bolt. You make sure that the pod or the container or the whatever doesn't get eaten and doesn't shatter, which means come apart and spread the seeds apart while they dry. If it's a sort of plant that tends to do that, you can put a bag around it if it's big, or you can make a little bag out of cheesecloth if it's smaller. That will still allow the seed head to dry out and mature. If you disconnect it from the plant too young, the seeds aren't going to mature. It takes energy, not just time, for those seeds to mature. So you got to leave it attached to the plant. If it makes pods, collect them when they turn brown, break them open and extract the seeds. If it's more an open seed head, like a Queen Anne's lace, cut off the seed head when mostly it looks dry, hang it upside down, if necessary, in a bag until it looks completely dry. And then you can crumble it up and discard the chaff, which is the non-seed part of the seed head. Crumbling it in your hands works. Sometimes throwing it in the air works. I learned what a threshold actually is, which is they used to pile all of the heads of grain in the barn, and then they would put a board across the door to hold the plants in while they threshed them, which was beating them and tossing them in the air and all of that. And the seeds settle to the bottom, and the chaff is high and can blow off. The plants listed at the bottom are all good candidates for this. If a seed looks mushy or very small or just different from the others, chuck it. No point in keeping it. Fleshy fruits are things like squash and tomatoes and apples and things like that. You leave it on the plant until it is well and truly ripe. With some, that means like tomatoes, it's starting to get soft, almost mushy. With some, like squash, it's got a really hard husk on it. Cut it in half lengthwise, scoop out the seeds. Think about putting them through a fermentation process, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Wash them to get off the pulp, let them air dry, spread them out on a tea towel or a paper towel, throw out any that don't look good. I've never seen eggplant full of ripe seeds. I just may not have waited long enough. But if you cut open a ripe eggplant near the bottom of the plant, opposite the stem end, you're going to see some little dark specks, and those are ripe seeds. Why don't plants germinate in the seed? Why don't they germinate in the fruit? When you think about the inside of a tomato at the end of summer, it is warm and moist and everything a seed could want. But most of the time, they don't germinate. There are a variety of mechanisms that plants use to stop the seeds from germinating too early. One of them is a germination inhibitor that in nature just sort of wears off after a while. You can guarantee that it wears off by putting a plant through a fermentation process, the seeds through its fermentation process. So for tomatoes, you would take the pulp, you put them in a container with a little bit of water, cover with a paper towel or cheesecloth, and you just leave it there for 3 to 5 days. It'll collect yeast out of the air, just like a sourdough starter would. And then you skim off the scum that forms. It is going to stink. And now you have seeds that could germinate. You can also just clean them really well and wait till spring. That works too. If you have large seeds like squash, you can either basically scrub them between your fingers under running water or in a bowl of water. And all you're trying to do is get them to be not slippery anymore. And then you spread them out. If you have little seeds like tomatoes and peppers, that could get really boring really fast. So you put them in a bowl or jar and you stir vigorously and you let it set a minute. The viable seeds will sink. The other stuff is going to float to the surface. So you skim that off, strain the rest out through a sieve, do it a couple of times, and that will probably adequately clean the seeds. Spread it out to dry. Moisture, light, and heat make plants germinate, and time. So you want to keep the seeds dry, dark, and cold. When the seeds are dry enough, you put them in a labeled container because you aren't going to remember next year which was which. If you put them in a clear jar, then put in some paper or something to block the light. If you're saving a lot of seeds, baby food jars work really well for this, but they let the light in. You can get packets of silica gel in the mall in any place that sells leather shoes, actually any shoes or purses. They just put them in the boxes and they end up on the floor. The mall is not going to mind if you pick those up and take them home for seed saving. They absorb moisture. So if you have a box full of little envelopes with seeds in them, throw a couple of silica gel packets in the box, and that'll help keep it dry. Store it in the fridge. That's a safe bet. We grow a lot of plants where the seeds are not hardy here. Think about peppers. I've never seen a pepper overwinter. I've never seen the seeds resprout in the garden. I have seen tomatoes. I haven't seen a pepper do that. So I wouldn't trust keeping peppers in the freezer. Put them all in the fridge. It works. When you bring them to room temperature, if you're going to start everything in the box, you can just take the box out and get to work. But if you're only going to start a few of the seeds in the box, get the box back into the fridge as soon as possible. What you don't want to have happen is for moisture to settle on it, because moisture may make the seeds germinate. I talked about one mechanism for seeds not starting too early, which is this anti-germination chemical. Another one is a requirement for stratification. And stratification means going through heat-cold cycles that, for example, might mimic a New England winter. So if a plant requires stratification, if you harvest the seeds in fall and you keep them on your counter and plant them in spring, very few of them will germinate because they don't think they've been through a winter yet. If you put them in the fridge, they will think they've been through a winter, but some plants beyond that need cold, moist. They need to feel like they were planted in fall, not just that they've been through a winter. And for these plants, you put them in moist sand or peat or both in a plastic bag, and you chuck that in your fridge for the required period of time. They are not going to germinate, but when you plant them, they're going to be a lot more likely to germinate. If the seeds are large enough that you can pick them out of that sand peat mix, that's great, do that. Otherwise, you can just plant them sand peat mix and all if they're tiny little seeds. Plan B is to plant them outside in fall, either directly in the ground or in trays or in pots. What Garden in the Woods, which is the headquarters of the Native Plant Trust, does is they sow a lot of their seeds just in trays of soil in fall. And it may take 3 years for the plant to come up if it's a trillium, but so what? It's getting the weather it needs. But meanwhile, It's easy to keep track of this is where the seeds are, and it's easier to ruck out any roots, any weeds that occur in there. Here is part of a table that shows germination requirements for a bunch of New England wildflowers, and there is no rhyme or reason to it. So you can see that the green column, Black-Eyed Susan, readily germinates with no pre-treatment. You can save the seeds, keep them on your counter, and sow them. However, if you go to the right column, if you want to grow spotted Joe Pye weed, you're going to get much better germination if they're in the fridge in that moist baggie for 2 months. So, especially with wildflowers, it's a good idea to look up to see what the germination requirements are. There is no expiration date on seeds. There is an expiration date on seed packs, but that is to kind of avoid a lot of frustration more than actual biology or botany. Seeds have been germinated that are thousands of years old. The germination rate is really low for those. So the numbers that you see on how long do seeds last are how many years are you going to get, I don't know, 85%, 90% germination rate. But the following year, you're probably going to get 75% and then maybe 65%. If you find a seed pack that's labeled as 10 years old and it's just another seed pack, chuck it. It's probably not going to work real well. And by chuck it, I mean just throw the seeds on the ground outside. Whatever happens, happens. If you find a seed pack that's 10 years old and your grandmother gave it to her and you love her dearly and you miss her, give it a shot. Even if you only get 1 or 2 seeds to come out of that, that's great. You got 1 or 2 seeds. There is no expiration date on seeds. Here are 3 pages of sources. So there's an organization called Seed Savers Exchange. Their mission is to preserve edible biodiversity. So they will save any kind of seed from any kind of edible. And they have on their website a great deal of information about exactly how to save seeds. While they are just focused on edibles, it's not clear that that matters a whole lot in terms of their seed saving information, because saving seeds off of a carrot is exactly like saving seeds off of a Queen Anne's lace. They're very closely related. How long to store, how long seeds last at high germination rate, and how to store them. There are a couple of good references in Johnny's Select Seeds and in Clear Creek Seeds and some other places. In general, when you are looking for information on the web, trust a .edu first, then a .org, then a .com. A .edu is a university. They should be telling you what they think is the scientific truth at that time. It doesn't mean that 5 years from now, they won't tell you something completely different as we learn more, but they're not trying to sell you anything. The cautionary note on the .edu is sometimes they have somebody else write for them. So see who's doing the writing too. If it's a staff member, a professor, or something like that, that's the truth as we know it now. A .org is trying to support their mission. So they're going to tell you their truth through that lens. Organic.org is never going to tell you to, I don't know, use Roundup. It might be the best answer, but they're not going to tell you that because it's not their mission. A nativeplant.org is never going to tell you it's okay to plant a hosta. And then a .com is trying to sell you a product. But they still may have excellent information because a company like Johnny's, for example, knows that if you keep coming back to them for advice, you're more likely to buy your seeds from them. So just make sure you don't fall into their, and the only place you can get it is here. How to start and grow most of the common seeds. Johnny Select Seed is again an excellent source. University of, I think it's Minnesota, also has some good, more generic information. So they'll tell you this is how you start seeds, and Johnny's will say this is how you adapt that for growing tomatoes or peppers or whatever. I recently stumbled on this fellow, Norman C. Deno, who wrote a beautiful, pedantic, but readable book on how to start 2,500 different plants from collection through germination. It is available for free online. If you are starting seeds that you can buy in a seed pack, you don't need this. But if you are collecting seeds, if you're trying any of the interesting, funky ones, I absolutely recommend that you go there because it's going to save you a lot of trouble, a lot of frustration to find out from the beginning that you need to hold this warm and dry for 60 days before you whatever. Timing for vegetables. A lot of people start their plants far too early because we're just so eager for things to get going. Robin's Farm Garden is a garden in Arlington, Massachusetts, close enough to Topsfield. And every year they publish their schedule online. So you can go there and see when do they start their broccoli and whether they start them inside or out. And if it's a plant you haven't grown before, just use their schedule and you'll learn after that. Then, which seeds to get? Again, Seed Savers Exchange has a tremendous variety. If you want to grow something that nobody around you has ever grown before, go for them. Cornell Vegetable Varieties is a crowdsourced site where people can write in and review what they've grown. The two issues with that site are people can't spell. So, for example, the bean Vortex is in there at least 3 different ways. And you have to pay attention to where the review is coming from because people are writing in from all over the country and sometimes not this country. So if somebody in Florida says this bean stopped performing when it got warm, it's not relevant up here. If somebody in Maine says exactly the same thing, that really does make a difference. All American Selections is a program that allows growers to request that a particular cultivar be grown against 1 to 3 similar cultivars. And if that's accepted, then those cultivars are grown together in mass, like a dozen or so of each, in trial gardens across the country. This applies to edibles and ornamentals. And if the trialed variety outperforms the competition in all of those sites, it gets an AAS tag on it. So you know it's a good, steady plant. When I was looking to grow a bok choy, I noticed that AAS recommended a particular bok choy called Asian Delight. And I tried that and it's worked just fine. Going more toward ornamentals, there is this bee ecology project, which is the result of some research on pollinator support. Excuse me a moment. We tend to talk about pollinators as if they are one mass that flourishes or declines together, but they're not. For example, in Massachusetts, there are short-tongued bumblebees, medium-tongued bumblebees, and long-tongued bumblebees. And they eat different plants. And the short-tongued bumblebees are doing great. and all of the endangered bumblebees are in the long-tongued variety. So you can go to the Beecology website and find out which plants will help the endangered pollinators, not just every other pollinator. I would add another one, which is Doug Tallamy. This is not in writing anywhere. Doug Tallamy has done a lot of research, him and his crew, on how to support the whole ecology out here. One thing he notes is that a chickadee requires 7,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of 5 chicks. Those caterpillars need to eat something. Mostly they eat native plants, but they don't eat all native plants equally. And something like 5% of the natives support 80% of the food chain. So you can go to Talamy's website and look for keystone plants of New England. And he will tell you, for example, that there's 2 yellow daisies. One is a helianthus and one is a heliopsis. They're both natives. To me, they're interchangeable. But for some reason, there are, I think, 57 different insects that will eat helianthus and only one that eats heliopsis. So if you want to support the ecology, you get the helianthus and not the heliopsis. Another place to look. Lastly, if you're looking for information about a particular plant, the Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder is an awesome site. It lists so many different plants, natives, exotics, species, cultivars, all there, how to pronounce it, what soil, what light it likes, what zone it likes, whether pollinators like it, whether deer like it, and on and on and on. They also have a plant finder, so you can say, I live in zone 5. I'm looking for a 2-foot tall flower that blooms pink in August, and they'll give you the best list they have. Cornell Vegetable Growing Guide is a set of, I think, 61 pages, each on a particular crop we might grow. It is focused on homeowners, and it will tell you when to start it, whether to start it inside or out, how far apart to plant it, any particular pests and diseases. The basic information you need to grow the plant. It will also list the 4 cultivars that are most commonly grown by farmers in New York. Those may not be the cultivars you want to grow because farmers sometimes are interested in things like mechanical harvest, which we don't care about. But it's not a bad resource and it's a good starting place. The New England Vegetable Growing Guides is written for farmers. So it has all of the information from Cornell, but it also has the next level of sophistication, including fertilizer schedules, including pests and diseases and other cultural matters, and including what can go horribly wrong and what caused it. So Cornell, for example, doesn't mention the fact that your squash plant may not make female flowers. New England Vegetable Growing Guide absolutely does. So if you've tried growing a particular vegetable in the past and it just kind of didn't work out, go look at the New England Vegetable Growing Guides. They may give you some insight. I see one thing has popped up in chat, and if any of the rest of you have questions, please say more about hosta. So the main thing about hosta is that it is not a native. So we go through phases in this country about talking about what we should grow. And one of the things that we're very keen on now is only growing natives. You don't have to only grow natives. Even folks like Tallamy, who spend their lives studying natives, would say that if 70% of the plants in your area are natives, that's enough. You have one big oak tree on your property, you've basically served the needs of a lot of the ecology. And there are plants like hosta that really are terrific plants in the landscape. So why not use them? There are, for example, there are a number of spring ephemerals. These are little bitty plants that come up before any of the trees leaf out. They flower, they set their seeds, and they then go completely dormant for summer, or they sometimes have a few leaves left. But they don't do anything again until next spring. And those include squirrel corn and Dutchman's breeches and some of the little bitty anemones and anemonellas and hepatica and on and on. But if you plant a whole lot of that, now you got a bare spot for the rest of the summer. So plant them next to a hosta because the hosta doesn't leaf out until these guys are about done anyway. And then the hosta leaves will cover the spot where they used to be, and everybody gets along great. Non-native absolutely does not mean invasive. There are so many non-native plants that aren't invasive. Massachusetts is really good about listing plants that they consider invasive and preventing their sale. When you are buying from a responsible catalog, you will see them saying things like, we're not allowed to ship this plant to California, for example, because it's dubbed invasive there. So pay a lot of attention to that, and you will probably not be planting invasives. Will hybrid orange Bennery zinnia seeds produce orange Bennery zinnias? Nope. They'll produce a few of them if they're not sterile, but as soon as you said the word hybrid, that says they're not going to breed true. Any other questions?
At this point, also, we can uh, end the recording part. So if people are a little camera shy, they can feel free to ask questions while they're here. So I'm going to end the recording here, and thank you everyone for participating. And if we hold on one second here.